As we're moving from that unknown to the known, let's take a look at this diagram to help us understand how this might work. The 30,000 foot view is we begin with some discovery, just like we talked about before. We explore what we're looking at, and then we have a design decision point. After this design decision point, you can see that we start moving into a digital phase of this, or a technology solutions phase to this. So based upon the experiences that we've defined we want to create and the design decisions that we make, we should then be choosing the technologies that we think we can begin to explore and then ultimately decide that can deliver the experiences that we've asked them to. As we get into this begin phase of the design thinking process, we want to open ourselves up to new ideas. So nothing here is good or bad. We're just beginning and trying to understand the context. We want to encourage divergent thinking. So we're not constrained, we're free from judgment, and we can kind of then begin to move towards this exploratory phase. One of the tools that we might use when we're thinking about beginning to empathize is an empathy map. Ultimately, this is an exercise for the group, again, this cross-functional team that you have with you, to start to understand maybe how the end user, the customer, however you're framing them, might be thinking and feeling, what they're seeing, what they hear in certain contexts, what they're saying and doing, and then really trying to understand pains and gains. Empathy maps can be used for a lot of different things in a lot of different contexts. Really, their end goal is to bring that level of thoughtfulness to what the user or customer or patient might be going through at a given moment for the problem that we're trying to solve. So really kind of digging into and trying to understand the context that they might be in and how they're thinking and feeling and all of these different things that the empathy maps helps us create a conversation around. Another great tool to help us empathize and as we begin to understand problems is contextual inquiry. In projects that I've worked on in healthcare, we've gone and visited with patients in the context of use. So in terms of creating a medical device, we went directly to the patient's homes and understood, well, what's your house like? What's the setup? What's the layout? Where would this device go? How would you use it? When would you use it? Why would you not use it? And then got a more broad appreciation for the context in which the patient found themselves. So really consider the contextual aspects of the problem that you're solving. Now, maybe you're not going to get an opportunity to go out to be in a patient context, but maybe you can draw upon some previous experiences. While anecdotal experiences aren't always the best to design from, they do help inform and start to drive a conversation about the patient issues that might arise in those contexts. So think about, do you have an aunt or uncle who has gone through this problem, maybe a spouse or even a child of your own that has dealt with some of the issues that you're trying to solve, and really bringing those experiences in and create the conversations and tell the stories that will help frame the problem that you're after. So without going into great detail, there's a lot of other different things that you can do in terms of beginning to empathize with the customer. So maybe you've conducted simple interviews with people that are representative of the patient or the customer or the user that you're trying to solve a problem for. Whichever method that you choose, you're likely going to end up with a lot of information, and maybe even not information, maybe just a ton of data points. Well, what do you do with those data points, and how do you turn those data points into actionable or understandable or even consumable information? A popular way of organizing or grouping this data to drive conversation and to help gain further insights is affinity diagramming. So in this exploratory phase, we're really out to make sense of things, right? We're sense making, and affinity diagramming done properly, again, can really help drive the conversation towards seeing the problems in a new way and encouraging different types of thinking that can help create unique solutions that aren't just, again, these kind of knee-jerk initial thoughts, right? We're able to look at an individual's problem or maybe an outlying issue and you're like, well, I can solve that very simply. But when you group all these things together and you start to get a more macro view of the issues and you're able to dive into micro areas of those issues, you may start to see a sequence there that is going to help you answer the problem or define the problem in a way that you wouldn't naturally see without doing an exercise like this. And the last thing that I'll say about affinity diagramming is it really does drive democracy in the conversation. Everyone has a voice, and as you go through this process of grouping and regrouping and having a conversation around a lot of the topics and thoughts that everyone in the group has, you really get a sense of an even distribution of the mind share within the group. Now that we have some sense on what we're working towards and framed the problem well, we move into the stage of ideation. And one way that we like to ideate is using a technique called how might we? It's a way to reframe the insights you've gathered into the form of a question. So, how might we? Insert your problem here. The idea is that we're suggesting that a solution is possible and that if you offer an opportunity to answer this question, there would be a variety of ways to move towards whatever the final solution could be. So framing a how might we question properly would not suggest a particular solution, but it would give us a good frame to begin this innovating process where we're able to work cross-functionally across our group and where we're able to kind of dive deeper into potential avenues, directions, and areas for solutioning. So some of the insights and themes that have come from your affinity map, you can begin looking at these insights and rephrase them as, how might we do X, Y, and Z? How might we help the patient's experience in this particular context that we're trying to solve for? Contained within the answers to these questions, you're going to end up with areas of opportunity for design. So you're going to look at your how might we question and ask yourself, does this allow for a variety of solutions? If it's too narrow, go more macro, go back up to 30,000 feet. If it's too broad, then find a way to narrow it. But you really should generate a number of possible answers, and this will become a breeding ground for a lot of good conversation as to the solution that you're going to end up coming up with. So these steps might seem pretty obvious, or maybe you're asking yourself, aren't we just really brainstorming at this point? And the answer I always give is, yeah, kind of. But what we're really trying to do is organize our process so we can stay on focus, stay on target, and move towards this solution that we're after by better understanding the problem. At some point we have to decide, and that's where we get into some level of convergent thinking. And that means we're just organizing what we've created, which ones stick and which ones don't, and what's really worthy of us pursuing. When we talk about convergence, we're going to have some outside influencers, things that help us decide. And so this is a good time to look at another one of IDEO's models, not specifically unique to them. A lot of people have things like this, but I think in the work that we're going to be attacking, I think this is relevant. So here you can see where they talk about desirability, or like the human desire for something, the viability, the business need, and marrying those two right there. That's a hard problem. But then we add in the third layer of technical feasibility. And for my dollar, humbly, I would say that the technical feasibility many times should come after desirability and viability. But in reality, that's not always the case, because we have a tech stack that we're working with, or we have something in place that we have to work around. But in a clean slate, perfect world scenario, the technology would come after we determine what the business needs are and what the human desires are. And you can see that the sweet spot in all of these is where IDEO would suggest, and many people would suggest, that innovation occurs. So when we think about plotting how we attack some of these things and the ideas that we've come up with, a popular way of doing this is looking at a model created by Noriaki Kano. Kano's model really focused on customer satisfaction and measures of quality. So he had 5 measures of quality: must be, one-dimensional, attractive, indifferent, and reverse. We're going to look at a more simplified version of his model today. And with this modified model, I'll take just a few liberties in how I describe some of these things, but it's all still the basic roots come from Kano. You'll see the X and Y axis. On the X axis, we're looking at done poorly and done well. And then on the Y axis, we're looking at satisfied to dissatisfied, denoted by the smiley face and the sad face. Kano's model suggests that if we do things which would be considered usable and we do them to the best of our ability, they don't drive that much satisfaction. If we deliver products and services or experiences which would be considered useful, we have typically and generally a 1-to-1 ratio of return on satisfaction to how well we implement them or how poorly we implement them. Then we come to desirability, and this is where it gets fun because no matter how well or how poorly we implement desirable features, we start to get a real uptick in customer satisfaction to a point. We can't just implement desirable features without having a product that is useful, something that I care about using, right? The app's just going to get deleted. Wow, that's really cool, but there's no real use for me. Or more severely and catastrophically, having an app that has just terrible usability. I can't log in. It crashes on me all the time. I don't understand the interaction design. Desirability is only going to get me so far. A popular way to use this model is to start to chart out and map out how you sprinkle in some of those desirable features, but really focusing on usability because it's a foundation, and then how you then focus on usefulness. But again, starting to understand, well, where can we add in this desirability? And it's important to think about it this way because over time, the technologies and the experiences that we have, they're fleeting. They start to degrade. So what was once very desirable becomes useful. And what was once useful becomes just a basic need or something that we would expect the technology to be able to do. So there's a lot of different, ways you can describe this. But, initially when Gmail came out, they had some email deliverability problems. But what they did have going for them is that they were very strong with this desirability of a full gigabyte at the time of cloud storage that the other services weren't providing. Now, a gigabyte of storage in the cloud is no big deal, but there was a time where that was a very desirable feature. Well, now you might say that that's degraded down to useful and for a lot of services down to just a very usable expectation that most consumers would have for a product. So we've gone through this begin, this explore, and this design decision moment where we've discovered, and now we're at this point where we kind of know our problem, what we've framed, and what we're designing for. And you can see in this model where we need to then begin again, and we need to begin prototyping and starting to test our ideas and creating new things that we can validate. And this is kind of maybe the more physical aspect of what we do, where a lot of people become highly engaged because we're going to start creating physical things. We're going to start working with real customers with the physical things that we create and seeing how they respond and react to what we've created, where they work, where they don't, where they break, and where have we not thought through the problem well enough, and what can we learn from working with real human beings. There's all kinds of ways to dive into this. Some of them are things like usability testing. That's like where we create something and then we have customers, users, patients go through the specific set of tasks that we've set out for them to see how well they are able to intuitively understand and use our designs. Do our designs meet their goals and their needs? A step prior to that might be something like a co-creation session where we're actually sitting down with potential customers and getting out pieces of paper and scraps of paper and sketching together and coming up with ideas and saying, well, this is what you're asking for and this is what we've created. Would this work instead? And kind of working back and forth and using your skills as a designer to understand what the real need is, abstracting out what the customer is asking for, and then being able to give them something back to see what their response is to it. At the end of the day, it's really just about getting out in front of a customer and having them interact in whatever way that works. And there's a lot of good methods out there, but it's going to be based on your timeline and maybe even your level of experience with some of the work. But really just getting a deep engagement and immersion with the potential customer, the user, the patient, whatever we're calling them, and understanding how they respond. And when this is all said and done, you're really just iterating. You're going back and forth with the design. You're optimizing areas. You're getting certain areas to be super usable. You're going to add features. You're going to take features away and probably strip it down to its essence to make sure that whatever you've put out there is highly usable, highly useful, and, sprinkled in a little bit of desirability in there just for the fun of it. So we've talked about beginning, we've talked about exploring and deciding, and how in a well-functioning organization that has this organizational value around design and applies design thinking works seamlessly to allow this beginning and this exploration and this deciding to be part of what they do and how they operate. We've talked a lot about design and design thinking and how these processes and these tools can be used for a lot of different applications. And you don't have to have a long history or a formal design training to be able to apply these tools and processes to your daily work. Of course, it never hurts to have someone in the room with some formal training or a long history in these things to help facilitate the conversation, but really anyone has the ability to do these different kinds of design processes and put them to work for their needs. Tom and David Kelly wrote a book called Creative Confidence, and one of the guiding principles in the book is just like what we're talking about. Don't be afraid to just jump in there because these tools and these processes are there to help guide you. So they say in the book that striving for perfection can get in the way during the early stages of the creative process, and that's exactly why we have this plethora of design tools and methods for you to choose from. It's the same thing with any new skill. It's the same thing with going to the gym. It's the same thing with starting anything new or changing a behavior. The best way that you can do that or achieve any of those goals is to just begin. Start doing it. And I hope that we've given you some good examples in this conversation over the last half hour or so to give you those tools to just get you started.